And so our intention for this evening was to kind of do a workshop that focuses on the most recent, say the last maybe year and a half, changes and kind of retooling and reconfiguration of the child detention complex, from the kind of federal level to the way that that's impacting us locally. So maybe if we could have a show of hands, are there any folks here who feel like they would benefit from a very quick review of the basic kind of 101s of the child detention system, the UAC system? Okay, cool. All right. So we want to do that.
Yeah.
I think we have one. Did we just have one? Yeah, we just had one kind of slide that maybe sets that up. So as you might know, there are several facilities in Chicago that are operated by Heartland Alliance and that are facilities that detain migrant children. And there's over 100 of these facilities around the country. And these are part of a complex that is called the Unaccompanied Alien Child Program, UAC. And recently we've seen in federal documents that they're kind of calling it UC, just unaccompanied children. I think they're kind of starting to drop the alien out of the official terminology. So the UAC program, this is really a program that targets, it sort of names what happens to all the young people who are under 18 years old who are apprehended by any law enforcement agency whatsoever, and who are suspected of being undocumented, right? So they might be apprehended by Border Patrol in the act of crossing. They might be apprehended when there's a raid on their parents' homes. They might be apprehended when there's a traffic stop. They might be apprehended if they have like police involvement in other ways. Please note that unaccompanied does not mean they are not in the presence of a family member or loved one or guardian or parent at the time that they're apprehended. They might well be with someone, but for a number of reasons they become separated because of the involvement of these various policing agencies, right? And then they're considered legally and technically unaccompanied.
And that the standard that is used to designate unaccompanied is that no adult who was present could prove legal guardianship over the child.
Right. So that would mean that a person who's present has to prove that they're over 18, and they have to be able to prove that they are a guardian or parent, right? And so you can imagine many situations, even in our city, like right now, in which if you are, come on in, have a seat. If you're a young child of an immigrant family who may be, for whom English is maybe a second language or is not as familiar, and when the pigs are targeting your family, considering that they're possibly undocumented, you can easily see how this kind of separation could take place, right? How you could become designated as unaccompanied, even though you have family and loved ones. And we know that even the young people who are apprehended crossing the border, hi, you want to come have a seat? There's seats here. Even young people who are apprehended crossing the border, they are often, most often, in the vast majority of cases, on their way to be reunited with loved ones. So even if they don't have family or parents or guardians at the moment of their apprehension, they're on their way to being reunited, right? And this is according to, we have lots of documents on the website and that we can provide according to kind of the federal documents themselves. The vast majority of young children who become detained in this way, according to the government investigation themselves, it is proven that they actually did have family in the United States that were waiting to receive them. So they're apprehended en route to reunify, and they're detained and considered unaccompanied.
Another thing is that the system of UAC detention centers likes to call themselves shelters and likes to portray that they are rescuing 5-year-olds wandering in the desert who are all alone, and God forbid, anything should happen to them, and that's
traffickers.
Right, a real misrepresentation. A lot of even the people who are crossing, who are trying to reunite with family who are already here, they are traveling with somebody. It could be a sibling, it could be another family member, it could be with a different adult that they are supposed to be with, but because it doesn't, count in the eyes of the pigs who have this standard of proving that you're the legal guardian, they become designated unaccompanied.
Right. And so we're using this designation. We know these are really dehumanizing terms, and it's really against our every fiber of our being to apply these terms to these young people, but what we're trying to do is present kind of the logic and structure of the system itself. So we are going to be using their terms. We're going to say these are considered UAC children, right? Once they are considered this, once they're technically considered this, they're considered unlawfully present in the United States, and that's really important to remember for UAC young people. They're placed immediately under deportation proceedings, right? So as soon as they're apprehended, wherever they get transferred to, there is a piece of paper called Notice to Appear, which is sort of the very first legal move that the United States government makes, signaling its intention to deport you, right? So that officially places you under deportation proceedings. All young people who are apprehended and categorized as UAC have to go into mandatory detention. It's not a case-by-case thing. It's not a if you did something, you get detained. You have to be detained. But you are detained in specific facilities that are designated as facilities for UAC minors, which the operators of these facilities like to call shelters. But even all of the technical literature of the government themselves indicates that these are indeed lockups, right? There are some minimal standards to the conditions that these lockups have to meet. They have to be licensed in particular ways, and then they have to meet these very minimal standards as dictated by a settlement of a court case that's called the Flores Agreement. And there are various protocols then that these facilities, once they have these children in lockup, these facilities undergo a series of protocols called family reunification, or FR. These protocols consist of contacting the family and loved one of the young children. They all have phone numbers on them or have loved ones that can be called. The vast majority of them do. It's now the responsibility or the role of the UAC operators, the UAC facility operators, to investigate these families or to investigate these individuals to see if they are suitable placements, right? So they don't immediately contact the family member and say, hey, your kid is here, we'll bring your kid to you, which is what would happen, let's say, if my kid were lost and apprehended by some pigs, right? They'd be like, what's your mom's phone number? They'd call me, they'd be like, hey, lady, come get your kid. That's not what happens here. What happens here is the launch of a long and very exhaustive investigation whereby those people who are parents or guardians or family members and who can claim are struggling to reclaim custody have to jump over many hoops and have to be able to document all kinds of things. That they are indeed the family member and that they would make for responsible placements, right? And so imagine if you're undocumented, now you become the target of a pretty exhaustive investigation of your life, of your circumstances, of your household, of your income, and so forth. And you have to produce documentation to expose yourself and your entire life, other kids you might have in the home, and spouses and other family members, right? So, and it's only after one steps forward and agrees to be part of this kind of family reunification process that you have the ability to talk to the child, that you have the ability to be told where, how they're doing. You don't have the ability to know where they are, right? So this, what is officially called the family reunification process, is actually a long, drawn-out investigation of the families. And it's only after, if they pass this investigation, after they pass it, that there is a kind of move to then actually reunify.
And just two details about the family reunification process. Even though the UAC detention centers don't advertise this or broadcast this in any way, all of the information from their family reunification investigations gets passed to ICE.
Right.
And this is something that families have known for a long time and have been not believed about for a long time, that raids happen after information gets passed and funneled through the UAC system, that this is a pipeline of the violence towards families and communities. And then also just, that it's not just the person the specific person or people who are trying to take custody of the child, but that every person in that household has to undergo biometric information, like the investigations affect everybody in the household. It's a huge dragnet of information going straight to ICE.
And depending on what's happening nationally, Homeland Security has a lot of discretion in changing the policies and standards of proof, right? They can say, oh my God, well, forget about the biometrics for a month, because we have a backlog. And then all of a sudden for a month, nobody has to send fingerprints, right? And then they'll reinstitute that, right? So there's a lot of discretion up and down the executive chain in micromanaging exactly what are all the requirements. And there are many, many requirements that have to be met. Everything is documented in the case file of the young child, which not only follows them into deportation proceedings, but also is logged into the portal that ICE has access to. There's an ICE field agent who's the sort of assigned, right, to each of these facilities.
But this has played out over the pandemic as we've seen them use this discretion to raise or lower the barriers as they please through the past 2 years.
Yeah.
So that'll come back later.
And everyone knows, the families know and the young children know, that there's no chance they will ever see each other again unless they comply with what they're told are the rules, right? So the young children know you have to, play, and you have to be good, and you have to not fight, and you have to not complain, and you have to smile and be cheerful. And if you misbehave, this will, you won't get to see your family again, right? If you don't tell us information, you won't get to see your family again. Children are screened in many different ways. So all of this is happening in facilities that advertise themselves as shelters, in a process that advertises itself as family reunification, right? So it's been a long time coming for us to kind of unpack the language and kind of see what's hidden behind these sort of advertisements, right? These false advertisements. And today we want to unpack a different body of language that also has a really false builds a false image of what's really going on, which is sort of related to, but not exactly the same as the UAC system. We do want to say that these young people, when they are released from detention and they're able to finally go to family, they remain under deportation proceedings, so they have years of court cases that they have to, years of fighting their court case, right? They're not free, actually, and they're not with status. And so when we talk about UAC, young people who are UAC status, they don't have a legal status in the United States, and they are not refugees. They're not on track to receive refugee status. Some people, the heartlands of the world like to say things like, these are young refugees, right? They sort of use language that would make it seem as though there is a system in place to provide services for these young folks or provide a legal status for these young folks when there really isn't.
And also that some young people resist on the inside and know that all of the information that they would give gets passed to ICE, and purposefully, intentionally resist that system, and some of the young people who do this, who are older, then as soon as they turn 18, get aged out into adult ICE detention, where there's bail. The UAC detention is one of the only systems in the U.S. where, family members or loved ones or communities can't bond people out, and so that's also another outcome for some young people. I was going to say something about the confusion of refugees and the court cases that a lot of these young people face, that also there's been tracking that the majority of young people who actually do receive legal support, 72% win asylum cases. It's asylum court that most of the successful cases are, but that, again, this is not actually a platform for channeling resources to people who have asylum claims. That's not what it's set up for, despite the fact that when those resources are provided, most of the young people do qualify for asylum, for whatever, bullshit that is. But
right. So for our purposes, it's important. You can have a seat here. There's other seats. Please feel free. We just want to kind of underscore that this is a form of detention that has branded itself as social service, right? So we want to also share some of the research know-how that we've accumulated. It's not that difficult to track this program as long as you when you track it, when you look it up, as long as you start to decode what these terms mean, right? So HHS.gov, HHS is Health and Human Services. This is one of the federal agencies that has jurisdiction over this program. It's kind of an overlapping jurisdiction situation. Please feel free to come in, find seats, or sit on the floor here in front if you'd like. So HHS.gov, you would have to look under programs, social services, unaccompanied children, right? Because it's a big website, it has a lot of shit in it. So go under programs, social services, unaccompanied children. That's one source of information. Another one is the TAGS website. Another one is the USA Spending, and that's how we follow the money. This is where you get to see how big this economy is, right? How much funding goes through, which has been for the last 5 years at least, has been well over $1.4 billion a year, gets funneled into detaining young children, investigating their families, and so forth, right? And again, they have to do quarterly reports and they have to do annual reports. And HHS in their annual reports, every annual report that I've read at least, has sort of done the statistics and said, okay, so last year we released this many percent, 90-some% of young people to relatives, right? And if you read that backwards, that means that you detained this many people who already had relatives, right? So according to their own reports, this form of detention isn't really providing shelter to young people who have no family because they release these people to their families, right? This is a place where young people are held in order to be able to coerce the families to an investigation process. And the reasoning is always it's for their protection, because what if they're traffickers, and what if, oh my God, like there's this sort of horror. And this is supposed to be set up to protect young people, right? So the tags and the USA Spending websites are really useful in identifying the grants that are given to specific operators to be parts of this kind of logistics infrastructure of detaining children, and then you have to do a lot of math to figure out how much money is being spent quarterly or annually and how much money are specific operators making. So you need to know to look for CDFA 93676. That's one of the sort of key codes for unaccompanied children, just the residential part of it. So it's the kind of residential facilities or lockups. And make sure they through grants. There's also other kinds of federal funding, but the vast majority of funding is categorized as grants. You have to look at the grants tab. Okay, so now we're going to sort of jump forward to what's been happening in the last 2 years since the pandemic. Are we cool? All right.
Or were there any questions about the basics?
This was kind of a very quick review.
What is like the average amount of time that the UAC spends in those facilities?
It's a great question, and it is also one of those things that varies wildly depending on the discretion of the facility. Different populations of kids have been targeted for longer stays than others. So it depends. People sometimes are in for an entire year, sometimes more, sometimes a month. It depends. And we'll explore some of that too, of like how different populations of young people are treated differently in the reunification process.
So when you look at the HHS website, their quarterly reports will say how many young people have been in custody, right, or in care, they say. And they also have statistics of how long they've been in care or in custody. One thing, so they'll say like this quarter, there have been this many people who have been in care for a month, and this many people have been in care for 80 days or 9 months or a year. One thing to keep in mind is that oftentimes they transfer young people and they bounce them around in multiple facilities, and that clock is reset each time. So each operator reports and says, we've had this many people, and look, we've got them reunified in 50 days or in 80 days. But that doesn't count if that young person has been transferred from a different facility.
So one of the things that's been affecting the UAC system in the past 2 years since the pandemic is Title 42. And Title 42 was enacted by the Trump administration in March of 2020. It's this old public health law that allows immediate deportation at the border under public health emergencies. And so it was used to mass deport people at the border in the name of public health during the early days of the pandemic, and then has been fought in the courts ever since then. So when the Biden administration came in, they tried to exempt unaccompanied children from Title 42, and then some states that were controlled by Republican governors sued the federal government to keep Title 42 in place, and basically it's just been going back and forth in the courts ever since. One federal court ruled that Biden couldn't actually make an exception for children under Title 42, but then the CDC tried to end Title 42 entirely. That was blocked by a court. As of November, it was announced that it seemingly successfully has been killed, but I'm not holding my breath because it's been 2 years of back and forth on this, and also that key point of whether or not the quote-unquote unaccompanied children are exempted from it has something that has been continuously in flux over the past 2 years. From the data that we have, it's estimated that 16,000 UAC youth were summarily deported at the border under Title 42. And then since, especially kind of in the past year, it's been very uneven enforcement, and the data has been very difficult to track because as it has gone back and forth in the courts, there's been a lot of discretionary decisions made by Border Patrol who have kind of just done whatever they've felt like. At least so far as we can tell, the data has been very difficult to follow. And so what this has meant for especially people who have been trying to track and monitor who is in the UAC lockups here in Chicago and elsewhere, it's been very difficult to understand when they're letting, quote unquote, like letting people in to then lock up versus just summarily deporting kids, at the border. And so it's been difficult to know when there are influxes that come in, when there's no one's being let in for months. It's been very touch and go. Just also as a side note, Title 42 was playing out in the recent the Operation Lone Star that Governor Abbott has been doing of busing people from Texas to Chicago and other U.S. cities, and that another population of people who has been exempt from Title 42 has been people who are coming from Venezuela because of diplomatic web that Mexico would not deport people from Venezuela, and the U.S. doesn't have direct ties to deport people from Venezuela. So the Governor Abbott has targeted this community because they've been some of the few who have been let in through Title 42. All of this is just to say that it's been a constant factor in the last 2 years in terms of people like who is coming in and who's not, and how we try to respond to it.
Okay, so again, this is the by now over 400,000 children that have been detained since the program was first started. The vast majority of children in these facilities are UAC. We have noticed, however, some changes starting right after remember the airlift from Afghanistan, and this whole thing about how the U.S. was going to be like receiving all these folks who were refugees. So we noticed a lot of changes, and we noticed that there were children from Afghanistan who were being held in Heartland facilities. We did some research to try to figure out what's going on, like what is the situation of these young people. And there is a different status called URM. URM is not UAC. URM are children who are minors and who are undocumented, but who are granted this status, are considered lawfully present in the U.S. and are eligible for various benefits like Medicaid, SNAP, Social Security, resettlement assistance, and so forth. So who might these people be? There might be people who are refugees, or already have refugee status, already been given asylum seeker status, people who are Cuban or Haitian entrants, certain minors who are on a case-by-case basis being given a special status. young people who have been able to prove that they've been victims of human trafficking according to a law called the TVPRA. So now there are these two new categories of people who are considered URMs. One is called paroled unaccompanied Afghan minors, and the other is called paroled unaccompanied Ukrainian minors. And these terms mean something really specific. It's not a very open-ended terminology. We'll get back to what those things mean, what parole means and what UAM, what the Afghan minors and paroled Ukrainian minors mean. But there are historically these facility operators who operate facilities that are specifically housing for URM minors, so minors who are considered unaccompanied refugee minors. And on a national level, there are these two religious organizations that coordinate placements into local facilities that are state-run and state-licensed but federally funded. So they're not the same network of facilities as the UC or UACs, and they're not lockups. They're not considered or technically lockups. We all know if you've been into the foster care system, right? That's considered not lockups too. This is much more similar to a foster care facility system. And this is a list of cities where operators are licensed to be URM operators according to the most recent data that is publicly available, released by the federal government. Notice that Chicago is not on here, even though we know and we have seen young people from Afghanistan being held in these facilities. Okay, so a brief overview of the comparison between these two statuses, UAC versus URM, right? Unlawful presence, lawful presence, subject to deportation, not subject to deportation. One category is supposed to be in facilities that are considered UAC or UC, different funding stream, different policies. In URM facilities, or they're eligible for independent living or semi-independent living. So the older teens can petition to live independently or semi-independently. So these are distinct categories that they're supposed to have distinct outcomes. And our question is, or are they, right? When you listen to the rhetoric and you look at the policies, there's supposed to be this difference between these categories. What we were seeing on the ground is young people in the same jails, young people risking their lives to jump out of a fourth-story window from the same jails that were supposed to be unaccompanied refugee minors from Afghanistan, in the same jails that UAC people had been suffering in all these years. So we were trying to figure out, since we know that all the rhetoric surrounding the UAC program is bullshit veneer kind of propaganda, we're trying to figure out how, in fact, in reality, does the URM program really play out. So if you'll remember those two new recent categories, so the paroled unaccompanied Afghan minors and paroled unaccompanied Ukrainian minors. There are laws, there are statutes that were passed to define what these categories mean. It's very technical and it's very specific. So on the top you'll see the technical legal definition of one of them, and on the bottom you'll see a definition of the other. So we have to define the term paroled because that's a really important one here, but also notice that there is a time bracket, right? For the Afghani minors, it's between July 31st, 2021 and September 30th, 2022. And for the Ukrainian minors, there's also a time bracket from February 24th to September 30th, 2023. And they're considered paroled. So now we have to define what parole means. The type of parole that these young people are under is called urgent humanitarian parole. That can be designated at the discretion of Homeland Security or defined in congressional acts. And in this specific case, they're defined in congressional acts. An exceptional permission for entry and temporary lawful presence for individuals who are otherwise considered inadmissible. An individual who is paroled into the U.S. has not been formally admitted to the U.S. for the purposes of immigration law. Parole does not grant permanent resident status nor provide a pathway to U.S. citizenship. So parole is an exceptional, temporary, discretionary, and probationary status. And the young people in the two categories from Afghanistan and from Ukraine are paroled refugees. So they're exceptionally but in a temporary and probationary way, considered to be lawfully present in the U.S. In other words, their lawful presence has brackets around it. So how was this program in Afghanistan created? It was created through an Operation Allied Welcome. And there's laws, and then there's appropriation acts, right? There's the law to designate, and then there's the appropriation act to fund and kind of operationalize. So this is the Operation Allies Welcome is how we kind of can find or look up information as to what exactly is the situation with the young people who were paroled from Afghanistan. And important from here is that they are supposed to qualify for benefits such as SNAP and Medicaid and so forth, resettlement assistance, housing assistance and so forth. But their parole status expires in 2 years. The clock starts ticking from them from the day they receive that parole status. And then in 2 years, their parole status is done. So they have to, something has to happen for them to regularize their status in those 2 years. However, first there was Operation Allies Welcome. Now we're switching to Operation Enduring Welcome. Enduring Welcome. So the Operation Enduring Welcome is the code name for a change in which, as of October 1st, 2022, the Biden administration is ending parole as the main vehicle of admitting new refugees, migrants and refugees from Afghanistan. In other words, there's not going to be any more airlifts or any more ways that people fleeing Afghanistan can receive parole, urgent humanitarian parole, and thus try to find their way to the U.S. and then try to have this refugee status. Instead, that's ending, so no more sort of allowing people in under this paroled status, and supposedly prioritizing regularizing the status of people who are already in the U.S. But people who are already here under this status will have many hoops to jump through in order to regularize their situation, and the new arrivals will be almost nil. So this is some quotes from the descriptions that define this program and define what the placements should be or what the housing should be for these young people. And then it says, or they can be, quote, referred to the network of UC or UAC care providers. So there's these field guides that are put out. And there's a link to the field guide that this was taken out of. If they say it's not practicable, or there are not enough resources, or there are not enough operators in that part of the country, that young people can and should be referred to or placed in the network of UAC programs. So this is how young people who technically, we're told in the spectacle of the media and in the sort of rhetoric, we're told these young people receive preferential or privileged status as refugees. Many of them actually get funneled right into the UAC program anyway, right, to the UAC. And that's because they can do that because nationally, there's very little uproar about the UAC program being jails to begin with, right? So once they've established and normalized that UAC facilities are shelters, it becomes really easy to now funnel these sort of new waves of traumatized children, even as they have said, okay, we have billions of dollars put into giving preferential treatment and special status and calling these young people refugees who are paroled in the U.S. It becomes bullshit on the ground in the experience of young people's lives.
And also to just note that field guide was specifically for Afghani kids.
Yeah.
That we don't necessarily, I don't know that we've looked at previous field guides, because like we went over, there's been many other populations that have had URM status before, but not this specific paroled status that the Afghani and the Ukrainian.
So the top part is what the URM in general is supposed to be, and the bottom part is how that translates into the experience of the Afghani refugees. So UAM versus UAC revisited. Until now, it's like, okay, so there's supposed to be different categories, and one of them's in shelters. They're actually prisons, but we call them shelters. The others are supposed to have access to all these benefits and be in this lawful situation, right? But when we actually revisit and see that things like limited capacity, and things like limited funding, right? Any bullshit excuse that is possible can be used to essentially funnel both populations into the same detention system. Once a child is transferred to UC Care Provider Network, and this is where the language is really important, the fact that they've been able to normalize the UC jail system as a provider network, ORR continues to apply the Flores minimum standards and so forth. So in other words, now there's this rejigging. Everybody's in the same system, even though there are claims that they have different kinds of protocols and different levels of access to sort of different degrees of unfreedom, right, are supposed to be parsed out here.
Standards of care.
Standards of care, by which they mean degrees of unfreedoms, shades of incarceration. So from our perspective, UAC and URM create a certain kind of objectification of people and also a system of stratifying people. Classification systems and field guides and a kind of language system that parses out degrees of illegality and corresponding degrees of unfreedom. In many ways, the URM populations, the recent URM populations, the Afghani youth and the Ukrainian youth, there's been a tremendous political spectacle created through their bodies, or they've been used and manipulated in order to become a political spectacle. And this is, right, how sort of U.S. can kind of justify its geopolitical interests and imperial interests and pose as this sort of humanitarian rescuer of young people instead of like as the sort of an imperial power that created these problems to begin with. So as the humanitarian language is deployed and all of its aesthetic, right, is being deployed, it's actually working to sort of be a system that renders young people's bodies detainable, exploitable, and ultimately disposable, right? Because remember the 2-year, even in the best case scenario for these Afghani youth, even if they do end up in, let's say, a nicer facility or an independent living or semi-independent living, which none of the ones in Chicago end up in, their status is still a temporary 2-year status only.
So one of the things that we've been trying to parse through is to track the differences in double standards that are being applied to different groups of children, particularly the paroled URM youth from Ukraine versus Afghanistan, and then also continuing to compare that to all of the children who are in the UAC system. And so we try to look at differences before the border or at the border, once they're in custody, in the sponsorship/reunification processes, and then in the struggle for long-term status. And I feel like we've tried to lay the groundwork that some of these differences are from differences at the source in federal policy, and then others are the discretion of agencies and are sometimes a bit more difficult to track. So this is to the best of our knowledge, but this is probably only a snapshot of how all of these differences have played out. So before the border and at the border, one of the differences that's from the top is quotas for how many Ukrainian versus Afghani refugees in total, but also specifically children, that it has pledged to relocate and to give this status to. So the pledge from the get-go was 100,000 Ukrainians and 79,000 Afghanis. So there's a discrepancy from the get-go. And another thing at the border that has been tracked, probably not perfectly, there's probably been a lot more instances of this than we even have data about, but Border Patrol and ICE voluntarily waiving the Title 42 restrictions just for Ukrainian kids, even if they're deciding to continue to deport other kids under Title 42.
Are those numbers for just kids, or those were numbers for the total?
The 100,000 and the 79,000 is total,
Okay.
not just for kids. So in terms of length of custody, this is another difference that has been tracked, that the length of staying locked up for the Afghani children appears to have been much longer than with Ukrainian children. We don't have solid numbers, but that just a tiny fraction, in quotes, of Ukrainian kids are still in custody, versus hundreds that are still struggling to reunite for Afghani kids. Also, a difference in the lockup is and again, this seems to be discretionary allocation of resources, is how many resources are made available for appropriate translators or anything resembling actual care that might be different between Afghani kids or Ukrainian kids. So in the process of reunification, sponsorship, in getting the hell out of there, this was difficult to find in official reports, but we have heard from families in Chicago that the income requirements for sponsors was being waived for Ukrainian kids, but that families who were coming to offer sponsorship for Afghani kids were being turned away because of the income-based requirements. So they were keeping those requirements for Afghani kids and waiving them consistently for Ukrainian kids. Again, couldn't find this in official documentation, but this is from on the ground. People who are also trying to combat any sort of claim that no one is coming to claim, or offer, actual shelter for the Afghani kids. Also, in terms of long-term status, so both Ukrainian youth and Afghani youth are on this 2-year humanitarian parole, but Ukrainian kids are immediately eligible to apply for expedited permanent status, which is called special immigrant visa. So at the end of the 2 years, they will automatically be immediately eligible to apply. It's still not guaranteed, right? It's just the eligibility to possibly apply is immediate. With the Afghani kids that are on the 2-year humanitarian parole, they are not immediately and automatically eligible to apply for this special status. And this is something this is in the federal policy from the get-go. This was fought over in Congress and was basically knocked out of the provisions for the paroled UAM kids. They are only eligible to apply for another 2-year temporary status. And most other children who were not deported under Title 42 and who have been in the UAC system over the last 2 years are still fighting their cases in asylum courts as per usual, if they are choosing to comply with continuing to show up for court dates at all, which is, again, another thing that sometimes children and families choose not to do. So part of what we would love to continue to process collectively and ask collectively is how this system of racist double standards and discrepancies that are very intentional will continue to play out and continue to be weaponized in crises to come. And then what resistance to that will look like. One question that we asked when we first did this presentation less than a month ago, I think, which we still don't have any clear answer for, is, for example, will there be an influx of children from Pakistan because of the catastrophic flooding that happened, and what status will they have? Because, it's a continuous piecemeal scramble to objectify and stratify for every single new crisis or influx that occurs. We haven't been able to find any information so far about if this has happened, and if so, what the status has been. But it continues to be a question for future migration because of war, conflict, climate disaster, and will continue to be something that both the state and these entire intertwining systems, and then communities who are affected by it and communities who are struggling against it will continue to have to contend with.
We're trying to learn about, right, how parole, so parole creates a kind of state of exception, right, or exceptional status. And we all know that state of exceptions are, those situations where new forms of oppression and domination and subordination, right, get experimented with. that then become implemented or regularized, right? And become more permanentized in other ways. So a state of exception is always something that we need to pay really close attention to. We need to pay close attention to what's happening with these exceptional refugees, right? And how they're being used in this kind of experimental moment. And we need to kind of not believe that what we, that when Heartland sort of puts them in the windows and say, look, these kids have, they're in here and they're able to play and they're able to watch TV whenever they want and they can go to the park, right? Sort of these young people are being used in this way, right? And they, actually are eligible for way different kinds of facilities and way different kinds of resources than this kind of fake shelter that they're being locked up into. The increasing integration of different categories of refugees and illegalized children into this sort of market of congregate care and the expansion of what congregate care, right, as a market in terms of its expansion, how many agencies are involved in it, how many operators are involved in it, how fast it's spreading all over the country, and also the dollar amounts. So these are some of the operators that are involved. The direct UAC operators like the Heartlands or the Catholic Archdiocese, which actually run and manage facilities. There are different kinds of subcontractors. There are companies that provide compliance. And in Chicago, the people who come into these facilities to do compliance reviews are General Dynamics, if you all know this sort of transnational sort of weapons and securities firm. They're the ones who physically go into the facilities and review the cases to do compliance review. There's logistics providers. There's providers that do their data solutions or their integrated kind of computer platforms. Transport providers, right? So the vans and the drivers to and from the airport. Medical providers, people who do the vaccinations. Dental providers who are supposed to do dental care, but they actually run forensics dentistry care tests on the young people. And we now actually, SALT recently has helped to bring to our attention this kind of new field of agencies that are ripping benefit off of this, which are these kind of associations, promotional agencies, and brokers. So these companies that teach other companies how they can become qualified to be an operator in this industry. So this is one example, togetherthevoice.org, and GD is General Dynamics. So togetherthevoice.org is one of these companies that makes its profit by consulting and training and encouraging operators to become qualified for being a UC or UAC provider.
So one thing that we didn't focus so much on today, but that had been a focus earlier in 2020, was right when the pandemic hit, and there was a court case trying to advocate for immediate release of all of the children in the USA system. And it was really interesting to track all of the documents that came out of this court case and to hear these lawyers, which are in no way representations of the actual struggle against the system, making the arguments in court that there needs to be a system in place for these children that doesn't involve mass detention and doesn't involve mass congregate care, with that being in quotes. That's one of the terms that they used. And eventually, that court case did result in the, surprise, surprise, immediate successful release and the dropping of a lot of these barriers to release of the children. Like we were saying, that this actually is something that they can just snap a finger and suddenly no longer everybody has to give their biometrics in every single household, this, that, and the other thing. But this kind of push to have more smaller facilities seems to be one of the outcomes of that struggle from April of 2020, right? That if we just make it smaller scale, broader, have a bunch of different friendly looking, sort of like residential house looking facilities, that's the solution, right? That will avoid some of the spectacle of these much larger, for as much as all of them are prison-like and some are still play that game, or all of them play that game, that some of these larger facilities that had the big COVID outbreaks in them, including Giles in Chicago, to sort of avoid that spectacle again, that this is some of the outcome of some of what we had all been tracking back in the early days of the pandemic.
Yeah. So it might look like decarceration, right? Because we're going to see, you remember the tornillos? You remember those big, the camp, the concentration camp looking ones out in the desert in Florida, where thousands of kids and so forth, right? Those were set up as temporary influx facilities from the get-go. Those were set up to be temporary, and we knew this. These small facilities, the heartlands, they're not temporary. They've been around for a long time, and they fly under the radar because once young people arrive in facilities that are normalized as shelters, that looks like decarceration to people, right? So again, going back to how to track the UAC program and government records, so we see that it's important to sort of learn about URM program, but our focus really needs to stay square on the UAC program because that's kind of where the normalization of the detention of children takes place, and then everyone else can easily be funneled into here, right? Everyone else that supposedly has a slightly better, degree of unfreedom, actually can very easily slip into this one as well. And not to mention, this is the vast majority of young people are in this rather invisibilized category. And I think that's what we have. All right, so we'd love some questions.
Do we want to mention the brunch really quickly?
Yes, would you want to mention the brunch really quickly?
Well, so Harlem Alliance, who operates the 2 prisons in this neighborhood, Giles, and are there other ones still open?
On the far south side, yeah.
Yeah. Well, so they are having their annual holiday brunch at the Ritz-Carlton on December 4th. This is where people can buy, I think they're like a minimum $200 tickets. And they watch Evelyn Diaz talk, the CEO, and there's weird honorary awards and stuff. Whatever. It's just like weird nonprofit bullshit.
It's a fundraiser.
It's a fundraiser.
Because they don't have enough money.
Yeah, because they don't get enough money from the government, I guess. But yeah, so it's at the Ritz-Carlton, December 4th. Our start time is 10 a.m. because the start time for the gala is 11 a.m. So we anticipate that people will start filtering in earlier than that. And basically, for years now, people have been showing up to these to disrupt them, make them unpleasant, and not let these people be comfortable at their own time. So.
It's one of their big events where they get to have all their, billionaire friends come and pat each other on the back for giving back and doing good, and rescuing children. And so it's really nice to be there and kind of, make them edgy and kind of ruin their party as much as we can. If you'll remember when there was a series of really desperate escape attempts from the facilities in Chicago, and many instances of psychiatric hospitalization, psychiatric emergencies, instances of self-harm, that it became a thing, like the media actually got interested, and it was like, it like somebody paid attention, and then Dick Durbin and others, sort of flexed their muscles in front of cameras and said, well, you really need an investigation. And so there was a federal investigation to see like what's going on inside these facilities, which Heartland said, we enthusiastically cooperate with this investigation, we want, to be transparent. And so the conclusion of the investigation was that, the situation is bad because they don't have enough funding. And so the result of the investigation was just to increase the funding streams. And in a context in which every time that there's some attention brought to this system, right, it gets reframed as, well, everything would be fine if only there was better funding, right? And so then the same operators just get to grow over the years. We've seen this system growing. We've seen the market for it and the profits for it growing. And as we're in a situation where in the last few years it's become more and more possible to hear conversations about police abolition and prison abolition, what we're also hearing is defund the police and fund social services. And in a town like Chicago, Heartland is deeply positioned to be the solution. Heartland is ideologically, politically, rhetorically, in terms of image and in terms of their proximity to power. They are the inheritors of that new funding stream. It's going to be the Heartlands of the world who will be receiving even if we do defund the fucking pigs, which we're so far from doing, what is being imagined is moving resources away from this kind of pigs and into social service agencies that do the work of detention and do the work of incarceration under a different form. So as, people who are like, opposing state-sponsored violence and incarceration in all its forms, we have this expanding market in our city, and we have a key player. It might seem like it's not a big deal. We're not like Texas, right? Because Texas has more of these facilities. But not only does Chicago have a lot of facilities, it has this sort of darling of the nonprofit world to be the poster face of this industry, right? It has the operator that nobody wants to challenge. A lot of the operators in bigger states with bigger numbers of detainees, a lot of their operators are being challenged, right? They don't have the kind of, infallible sort of media presence and reputation that Heartland does, right? So Heartland has had a sort of monopoly on presenting itself as a savior for such a long time. So in many ways, we are like right in the heart of the beast here, because if we can, sort of permanently discredit Heartland and permanently discredit and make it impossible for them to continue to sell this business that they're doing as being a solution or being a decarceration, right, a path out of incarceration, then we're hitting a blow at the sort of industry nationally, right? So this is kind of what the stakes are for us. It is, of course, about showing up in solidarity with young people who are detained, right? This is about those very specific individual people and trying to show up with our bodies to sing, to chant, to do whatever. But it's also about this larger, the function that this particular entity plays in the larger engine that drives the growth and expansion of this industry, if that makes sense. Like we have a target that is kind of like the target. It's like the perfect target and the most necessary target for us to really go at and go at hard.
Yeah, also just wanted to say the brunch disruption action is great fun. If you can show up, please do. Mm-hmm. It's great, you get to yell at rich people. But also, there are other ways to get involved. There are people including local drag queens performing at the brunch, and we are putting on a campaign to get them to drop out. We're also going to be, I think we're going to be calling the Ritz the day of, which is always really fun. They get super annoyed at you. So if you can't attend, there are different ways to plug into the event and like support the people on the ground.
Whatever we've learned as community organizations has been because current detainees or former detainees have done things or have said things to get the information out. Whenever employees become whistleblowers, time after time they tell stories about something the young people did to prompt that, right? It was something a young person did that pushed them to acknowledge the reality of their complicity in this thing. And so it's really the agency and the source and the origin of all of the change we've been seeing so far is really being the young people themselves. They've pushed us, they've pushed the employees, they've freaking pushed everybody. And it's their often desperate actions and courageous actions, sometimes coordinated actions, that really have moved at all the needle on this, right? So it's not really because the people in this room have done this work. It's because the young people inside have been resisting and provoking a conversation on the outside, because families themselves, after a few years ago, there was this like congressional uproar about the fact that 50% of the families were absconding from follow-up court dates, right? So when the youth are released to their families, they remain under deportation proceedings and are supposed to show up in court. And in a certain year, there have been 50% of these families had absconded. They've gone into hiding, or they've changed their identities, or they've just refused to show up in court. And that's a huge refusal. That is a mass kill. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people are absconding, right? That's again a very collective form of political protest and refusal. That is then a kind of call that we have to respond to. That's a call. It's a call response situation. We are simply responding to what we're seeing as a really enormous struggle that's being waged, with detainees, former detainees, and their families and communities constantly pushing the conversation through these different activities that are often like not seen or unacknowledged, or they're framed as a problem, right? Like the congressional leaders are like, we are of a problem. These people are falling through the cracks, we're losing track of these children. What if they're in danger because they're absconding from, what if the traffickers got them, The traffickers didn't get them. Families are resisting, right?
What might like a world look like where a solution has been found? Like, what might a solution to this look like?
But my shorthand for that, and I don't know if you have a different one or other people, my shorthand for that, I'm a parent, I have a kid. My shorthand for that is that every child who is somewhere will be treated like my kid is, right? If my kid goes across the street and is lost, or something happens, and somebody goes like, hey kid, what are you doing here? Where's your mom? They're like, here's the phone. They call me, I come get my kid. That's it, right? That is exactly what should happen for every single child that may be at some distance from a parent or loved one, right? For whatever circumstance. Obviously, I think that people should be able to migrate freely, and people should be able to make decisions autonomously about where is a good life for them, right? How they want to govern their own lives individually and collectively. So the sort of illegalizing migration is obviously a big problem to begin with. But there's no reason to assume that some people's kids, should be engaged with in certain ways, while other kids sort of require vast networks of investigation and detention and sequestration at all.
Because 90 to 95% of the kids do have parents or immediate relatives
Right.
in the U.S.
It would be great if a fraction of this funding would be used to actually help them go, help them arrive where they need to go, and help those families, with some resources. All of these resources are put to like apprehension, sequestration, investigation, probation, and then follow-up prosecution. You know what I mean? So a world in which like none of this is necessary is basically the world that I fucking live in. I'm not under constant probation. My kid's not under sequestration. I'm not being investigated as a parent. Hey, that's a world that's real to me. And then there's also like we could look at other countries that don't actually have mandatory detention for mass mandatory detention for migrants and so forth, right?
I was wondering if you could give me a little bit of clarification when you were talking about the. I wanted like 5 minutes to talk about it now, so I've forgotten. The detention sentence that were really big, and there was the court case. Were those children like actually released or reunified, or were they put into facilities like?
Oh, was this the court case in 2020? I'm forgetting what percent. It was in the 95, 96% were reunified immediately.
Oh, okay.
And then again, a very small percentage of youth don't actually have some of their and those kids got funneled somewhere else. But again, it was somewhere in the mid 90% that were just immediately reunified in that court case.
Right. And then there's another situation, which was in a few years ago, there were 2 really large facilities, one in Tornillo, Texas, and one in Florida, Homewood, Florida. It's a suburb of Miami. And there was a lot of, there were mass kind of struggles around closing those down, which were really successful, and we were really happy to see those struggles, and obviously really appreciated folks going into the desert and like camping out in front of these facilities and like trying to cause a ruckus and shutting them down. I think for our purposes, we wanted to make sure that that doesn't become yet another way that the Heartland type facilities win by being like, oh, but this is a better, alternative, right? And so the more that these spectacular images of these big detention facilities on the border, the more that they get circulated, the more that the heartlands of the world can say, oh, but ours is like, look how nice it is, right? It's in the middle of a residential facility, and we even take them to the park once a day. They even have outdoor time once a day, right? And they even get to have English class inside, and they have, and there's no bars on the window, right? And so I think both of those, they're like 2 sides of the same coin, and we have to go after both of them. When Tornillo and Homewood shut down, some young people were reunited in an expedited fashion, and others were just transferred right into the heartlands. The number of the the number of these smaller kind of UAC facilities around the country has been steady growing.
And that's part of why the discovering this new market of brokers has been just particularly sinister, like everything that you were unpacking of now, the language of decarceration, and that there's even just a market now for promoting it as like a cottage industry, literally cottage industry, to keep growing these smaller residential.
And there's consultants who will teach you how to jump through the hoops of getting the permits, right? They'll kind of simplify the process for you so you don't have to do it yourself. You don't have to be Heartland to do it. You can do it too. You can come to the annual conference, like a trade conference, right? They have a national trade association, and then you could go to the annual conference and go to the booths and probably go to the teach-ins. They're having their own teach-ins on how to open up a facility and how to get licensed. I have a building. I'm a developer, and I don't know how to make money. Hey, this would be great. I can go to the UIC Social Justice Job Fair, hire me some young, idealistic people of color, because that's where Heartland recruits, at the social justice job fairs and the diversity job fairs. And then say that I'm staffed and have all of the right kind of licensing in place and open up a facility. It's a guaranteed income stream. Oh, one over there and then over there?
Oh, whatever. No, I was right there. Oh, I was just gonna say, like, in relation to that, I don't know, I think it's ridiculous that, like, social work schools in the city just give a bunch of free labor to Heartland all the time through unpaid internships. And I know a lot of people have really had connections to these big universities here in the city. And, like, that's just, like, I feel like also maybe underlooked operators. That's just free labor. It's just free labor. And they have, like, they fully, like, willingly cooperate and, like, make those connections with Heartland all the time. And they
So
don't need to.
these should be here on our list of operators, right? The universities. That's really important. Yeah. And I don't know. Wasn't there somebody saying that Heartland is looking for volunteers for something? They're always looking for volunteers.
Tutoring thing?
Oh, tutoring. Yes, tutoring.
I feel like there's maybe a lot of people in this room who would be interested in learning more about plugging into those streams of free labor and disrupting or resisting or spoiling some parties, as is relevant.
And or just saying, hey, let's have a conversation. Let's do a workshop for you all, right? Let's do a workshop conversation for a particular group of people who find themselves in some relationship to this industry and are wanting to have a conversation about it, I think that's really great. I mean, many of us are in some relationship to this industry. It's weirdly enough, it has tentacles everywhere, So it's really amazing to kind of like acknowledge that openly and explore that.
You mentioned several things like doing research and going to these protests, and so I'm not expecting you to have interest because what you've done is already a lot. But I'm just curious, as somebody who lives in a neighborhood with these facilities, what are ways that have been talked about of not being passive?
Folks who are in the neighborhood who've been organizing here specifically, do y'all want to take that up? Because there are definitely groups that are specific, in Rogers Park, you mean? Yeah, that have been organizing specifically in Rogers Park around these two facilities. The rest of us show up in support of that work, and we're in dialogue with them, but there's definitely a crew locally here that should speak to that.
Gerardo's been kind of shy. You want to talk though?
No, go ahead.
Really, Gerardo's a much better source. I've been working on this for years. I'm more newer to the situation, but yeah, we've been over to the facilities at least 10 times in the last couple of years. We have spirited demonstrations, we make signs, we send in Valentine's Day cards. We just we try to keep an eye on like what's going on, if the facilities if there's people in them or not, youth are in them or not, because it can change. There's one on Morse, there's one on Chase. The one on Chase seems pretty much continuously occupied. The one on Morse seems more like sometimes occupied, but maybe more so now it seems. And we actually, when we were there the other day, a month ago, we didn't think it was occupied, but then we heard kids inside. So it's, yeah, we just try to keep an eye on what's going on, pressure, raise awareness in the community, and yeah, eventually shut the facilities down.
Yeah.
Maybe other people who've been working in the neighborhood have anything to add.
How do people join up as well?
Well, there is a group that was working on it, Rogers Park Solidarity Network. It's a little bit dormant, so it's basically Gerardo, myself, whoever else wants to step up in the moment, working with Rosalinda and Pura and other awesome activists from, South Side. I think what's a good way to get maybe just to go to one of the Instagram type of things. I don't know, y'all.
I think this is the space where you all meet, right?
Yeah.
So it may not be super regular and structured campaign against Heartland currently, but it's a good way to meet the people who have been involved in researching these places for a long time, and who do, whenever there's capacity, do a teach-in, do a demo. Some of the demos at the facilities have been required a lot of capacity, right? Because they've been like, let's all go together, let's try to get a big group, let's try to make it really festive, right? There's always like Halloween, there's always a parade for Halloween, right? But sometimes people from Rogers Park or other neighborhoods have done kind of noise demos in solidarity with the youth inside with really tiny groups of people, right? So Pura has Pura and their kids, and then Jeanette and her kids, and me and my kid, all of us one day be like, hey, I'll be in Rogers Park next week on Friday. You want to go? Sure. And so 6 people in front of a facility chanting, right? One person. So Jose, who used to be a detainee, who's become the most outspoken former detainee publicly against this, he told us on the first meeting we had with him that the first time he heard anyone outside of the building was one person who was chanting. There was this woman one day chanting. That's the first time I heard that anybody knew we were in here. And then the next week you all came and we saw a bigger group. And then it was just a few women, right? So even one person on the sidewalk, that when you walk by this facility, you just pause and go, free the kids, or do your own song or do whatever, right? That is something that registers very clearly for young people who think nobody knows they're in there. Nobody cares they're in there. They're essentially been disappeared into a black hole, right? So if you think about, imagine what can I do? Sometimes you have the capacity to get together with other people, organize something big, organize a teach-in like this, organize a demo, right? Sometimes you don't have that capacity, but you do have yourself and your 2 housemates or whatever, and a dog, and that's enough, right? That's enough. They'll come and tell you can't be here. I'm just standing here 5 minutes. I'm just going to do a song, So frequent, small-scale noise demos in front of these facilities are incredibly important in terms of solidarity for the folks inside.
Yeah, also because with the bigger planned demos, they will sequester the kids away. They will make sure the kids don't come to the window. Mm-hmm. They will have security out front taking pictures of people. They'll have the cops called, waiting for people. So having the element of surprise, having that spontaneity means that you might have a bigger impact, even if it's less people.
Right. So holding up a sign and chanting, a lot of times it's hard to know which part of the building the young people will be in. Some of us know these facilities better than others, and we can kind of share some of that knowledge, but they can always move the kids to a different part of the building. A voice, the buildings are so close to the sidewalk that your voice will carry. They might be able to keep the kids away from the windows, but they can't keep them away from hearing you. So literally chanting outside of these facilities, anytime you're in the neighborhood or you're walking by, if you walk on Chase or Morse, just give 2 minutes. Give yourself an extra 2 minutes that day. If you walk 2 blocks away, make the detour, right? And don't be afraid of doing it by yourself. I think it's a big thing for people to break the fear of being present at these facilities. When there's capacity to organize with other people to do that same thing, then you can blow it up and make it really big. When there's capacity to get together with other people who've been doing this as part of daily life, they're cool people to meet. They have a lot of also knowledge and stuff to share, but you also don't necessarily need that, right? You are equipped as of today. You have the addresses, and if you don't, let us know. We'll put them up for you. Anybody here is equipped to go by themselves or with 1 or 2 friends and, briefly show up for these young people at different times of the day. And that is a hugely powerful thing to do. Continuing to do teach-ins is a hugely powerful thing to do. We have, the Anti-Detention Network is a very loose and disorganized ad hoc group of people who sometimes are able to get together and do stuff, and sometimes we can't. You can form it, and there's some of us, right, because we're friends and it's an affinity, form your own group of friends and be like, hey, Anti-Detention Network, are y'all doing something? No, man, we're not, we're tired. Well, we want to do something, we'll show up and support, right? When the brown berets are like, we want to do some shit, we'll show up and support, right? People will come and support you once you reach out through the network, because it's the same people can't initiate all the time, right? We want to have these conversations, but it's really great when the Danzante group are like, we want to go do ceremony, we want to go do danza at these facilities. Oh my God, it was so amazing. Of course we all showed in support, So it's just like, if you have an idea, hey, do you all want to do another teaching at some other venue or church or whatever, we'll come. Hey, we want to go sing, but we're nervous to do it by ourselves. We'll put out the word, 2 or 3 other people show up with you, and you really don't need 100. You really don't need 50. You're really fine with a handful, right? But it is hard to start. It is really hard to start. It's really difficult to sort of expect people to be autonomous, self-organized, do your own shit, Let's support each other in this process of organization. Because of how they're located in the midst of residential areas, it's an extreme tactical advantage for us because we can organize at least solidarity presence there directly with the young folks very easily. That's easily achievable.
If I could just say, just add to that too, we've focused so much of today on Heartland, but that there is another contractor in Chicago, the Catholic Archdiocese of Chicago. And that I feel like another thing too is, if that is a lead that you have to follow, they shut down their facilities at the Maryville campus, and then there's been this facility in Lakeview that has just kind of been continuously shrouded and in flux for the last 2 years. And that's maybe less of a Rogers Park specific thing, but who knows? Maybe it is. We really don't have nearly as much of a pulse on what the Catholic Archdiocese is doing and how it operates. And then similarly, just going back to that idea of this industry has so many tentacles and so many, tendrils everywhere. And part of that too is constant turnover in all of them. That there's constant turnover in the employees and in the constant recruitment. There's constant turnover in the volunteers that get funneled through ICDI. So there's constant recruitment at various different faith communities. So if you have connections to any of these possible places where that constant work of filling the turnover is present, that's another site of sparking conversation, or of, again, inviting your friends who are involved in this somehow to organize something.
If you're on a campus, pay attention to the job fairs, which should be listed on the campus calendars, and they should be advertised around. This is something UIC people started alerting us to years ago. We didn't know. It's like, oh my God, there's the diversity job fair. Heartland Alliance will be here recruiting, right? And so people showed up to disrupt that. 3 people showing up disrupted the job fair enough to where Heartland packed up their table and left. They were unable to recruit. And it was 3 individuals who showed up and like, oh, they had 1 banner, not much of a plan. We'll be out front. We have some flyers, and we'll try to be loud. We'll try to talk to people as they come in and be like, hey, y'all, be careful. You might get recruited by Heartland. Here's what this thing is, actually. Here's the thing we printed from online. We have a lot of FAQs. You can print them, make your own. And that was enough to get them to pull out. And this was every time we've done counter-recruiting or anybody's done counter-recruiting, the same story. Just a few of us show up, 2 of us showed up, 5 of us showed up, and they packed up and left. It's a really effective thing because you get to have lots of conversations with lots of people who they're targeting as their future staff. And that's great. You get people's minds spinning, right? And you get to keep them from doing business as usual.
Just to follow up on the Rogers Park Solidarity Network, pretty dormant, but we are doing a once a month writing letters to prisoners. Here, the first Wednesday of the month, so the next one will be December 7th, 6 to 8. I think we said 5, but then I think we changed it to 6.
6 to 8.
Yeah, 6 to 8, Wednesday, December 7th, and it's a good time to write letter and also meet people.
Yeah,
let's
cool.
take a few more maybe, and then kind of
Yeah.
more informal right now.
Yes, I'm sorry. You've been waiting. Sorry.
No. I think I'm interested, at some point you mentioned something about how this kind of contributes to,
larger ICE databases and like systems, and I was wondering, does that have a relationship with like procedures that they put the kids through to get information, or like what kind of information do they need, and
Yeah.
whether or not also like kids kind of resisting this inside has been like trouble to them, or I don't know if you can share also.
So please remind me before we finish to put up the website, because there's actually a film that we just finished with a former staffer who describes some of these procedures a little bit, and it might be interesting or relevant to what you're saying.
One of the leads that we had also followed at some point was the company that has the contract to do dental forensics in the facilities, to supposedly confirm the age, in case, because again, these kids are subjected to suspicion that they're lying about their age, and so, and I
And some of them are not even
Of course. Why wouldn't you? Come on.
Yeah. But that there's a contract for dental forensics, and I'm assuming that all of that information is absolutely part of all the full package of biometrics, and lots of other types of information that's passed to ICE.
So from the second they arrive, the kids are subjected to investigation. From the second they arrive, all their personal belongings are taken away, their clothes are taken away, they're stripped, and their bodies are inspected by a staffer who writes down whatever markings there might be on the body. And it's just like, you can imagine, right? And then this is part of their record. They go through what's called an intake procedure. They're asked a lot of different questions, right? This happens even with the younger children, and even if they arrive in the middle of the night, right? So as soon as they arrive, there's the physical inspection and examination, and there's also a procedure of, being interviewed, and there's also procedures of being told, like, the new procedures and policies of the place you are at. Welcome to this. You are now a participant in this program. Here are the rules, right? Here's how this is going to go down. So this is something that is like sort of the normal intake process. And then after that, children are continuously interviewed by the floor workers, by the FR, the family reunification person, and by the clinicians, right? So they're constantly being asked questions about home country, about their family members, about their journey here. And those questions are not general. Those questions are probing for particular things. According to the operators, what they say is, well, we want to see if any of these kids qualify for relief through TVPRA. We want to see if they qualify for relief under protection for victims of trafficking. So we're going to probe for all kinds of trauma. Have you ever seen one of your family members being raped? Have you ever seen anybody touching anybody in this way? Have you ever seen anybody being killed, right? So there's like a lot of trauma probing that is happening to young people in a place where they don't know where they are, by people who they don't know who they are, and what interest those people have in their lives. Not answering is not an option. They know that if they don't answer, they will never get to see mommy and daddy again, right? And this is how the therapy works as well. If you act out, or you're not cheerful, or you don't talk, or you don't eat, then you go under this kind of one-on-one supervision, and you're most likely going to be required to meet with a clinician. This is not by request. This is not, you don't have a choice. I don't like this clinician. I need a rapport with another clinician, right? It's a mandatory kind of exposure, and then the clinician, again, gets to ask you questions about and probe for trauma. These young people are not told what city they are in or what this company is called that they're in. So they're not to know things. And yet they're constantly being asked to disclose things. Even the older teens who could know, right? You could tell them, hey, this is where you are, you're on this street, right? Call your parents, right? Tell your parents where you are. It's important for them, it's important for the operators not to have young people know this information, not to have the families know this information, right? Not have anybody know this information. So there's a lot of direct probing that happens through these interview processes, and it's always justified as, this will help you. This will help your case. I'm doing this so I can find your family. I'm doing this so I can see if you qualify for relief or not. I'm doing this because I'm a clinician, it's going to help you. I'm doing this because I'm a volunteer art teacher, and storytelling is a good way for you to express yourself, right? Draw a picture of, mommy, was there ever a gun? Stuff like this, right? So there's this always, and you see this in their quarterly reports or in their annual reports. Heartland will put in, we had these programs where the children drew stories, and they did stories about it. And it's always the children, stories being extracted from the children. In the few cases where former detainees and their families sued the operator, so there have been cases against Heartland Alliance for pretty extreme forms of sexual abuse and medicating kids with psychotropics and so forth, right? Even in those situations, then the lawyers ask the kids to testify, right? So there's this constant coerced extraction of one story that happens in this kind of environment, right? In this kind of environment of incarceration and sort of lack of any kind of agency. So, but most these procedures are described in a very benign way. They're described as interviews in order to make sure that the children's best interests are being represented. Right. So those are some of the more, the verbal procedures. There's definitely the forensics dentistry. There are these systems of kind of rewards in place where the young people who cooperate more or who are willing to be sort of monitors on other people get to have certain privileges like TV time that other people don't. There are young people who act out who get to be isolated, and act out can mean almost anything, including the refusal to eat, or keeping a snack in your pocket, right? So when you think about young people who might have the very important life skill of saving food for later, it's a very, very wise thing to do. If you put that apple in your pocket and you're found with it later in your room, that is called contraband, and you get all this goes in their written record. Everything, and they're constantly seeing staffs with clipboards, writing. You're doing this, it is written down, right? And so Jose kept saying, they're always writing it up. It's always written up. Everything's written up, right? This is terrifying to people who are trying to be under the radar. That's what happens when you're trying to cross illegally, right? You're trying to not have anybody that has any connection to the U.S. government write anything down about you, right? So they know that their families are being treated to the same level of scrutiny, and that they themselves are under constant scrutiny all the time for their behavior and for their activities. They're often being asked the same question over and over again to check and see if they're lying, because they're never believed, right? So they might have to repeat the same information many, many times. If for some reason they give slightly different answers different times, then the whole thing goes to shit, as you can imagine, right? I would give you different answers I often remember shit wrong, So, my case might be delayed for months at a time, each time I say something that's slightly wrong. Sometimes families cannot come forward and subject themselves to this investigation. Sometimes families have to make that painful decision that, I can't be investigated. So what are your options then? In some cases, families find a proxy. This guy, if I pay him this much money, he's willing to act as uncle so-and-so because he stands a better chance, right? He can afford the scrutiny, and he stands a better chance of looking like a good sponsor. Every so often, Heartland will figure out that that's a lie, and then they'll be like, look, we rescued this child for potential trafficking, right? Then they get to claim a victory that they have saved a child, So all these different things are happening at the same time. There was a leak. I think Anonymous managed to get a document leak from Heartland's internal documents, and they did a big document dump. It was 200 pages a few years ago, and it was all their internal procedures and their internal manual.
Y'all mentioned the people that are arriving, that are being bused from Texas to Chicago. I can only imagine that a lot of them are children. I think they're in Heartland facilities. Do we know this? Do we know where they are?
Please correct me if someone knows differently. But from what I understand, is that the people who are being bused are either individual adults or families, where the children have not been formally separated and are traveling with people who met the standard to not be separated. And that any kid who is arriving at the border is just being immediately funneled into a UAC facility and is not being targeted for this specific bus scheme.
Can you say the name of the website real quick?
The name of the website is noshelterproject.com, and there's there's a few like things about the films, a few things about like the detention industry, a very basic overview, something about the Chicago facilities, and then a little bit more of a kind of political call. And then here there's a number of films. And Life in There, the last one, is kind of a 20-minute one that is based on the testimony of a whistleblower who was a staffer and who describes these procedures, the specific procedures inside. And he describes the very simple, basic ones that are not very spectacular at all, but it's kind of an interesting testimony.
All right, cool. We want to thank everybody for coming out. Really thanks for Lynn, Rosalinda, presenting, everybody. People are welcome to hang, talk, mingle. There's still a lot of food.